Good morning, everyone. My name is William Hubbard. I'm from Columbia, South Carolina in the United States, and it's my honor to moderate this panel of distinguished scholars and activists and leaders this morning to talk about the rule of law, the current state of the rule of law amid a time of geopolitical unrest in some places, instability in other places. So this should be a lively discussion. We promise you we're not going to start with opening statements that will put you to sleep. I know some of you have jet lag this morning, but we appreciate all of you being here. We appreciate your attention. Let me introduce our panelists. First, you know Juan Botero, he of the World Justice Project, our executive director. Mamphela, Ramphele from South Africa, who has been a leader for civil rights in South Africa and around the world for many years, and we're grateful for all of her efforts for justice. Dean Liz Magill, you heard her yesterday in that brilliant interview with Justice Ginsburg, the Dean of the Stanford Law School. And last but not least, John Nery, the editor-in-chief of the most influential and widely read newspaper in the Philippines. So with that, Dr. Ramphele, we have discussed previously on some of our preparatory calls, you've discussed and outlined some of the cultural barriers that exist currently in South Africa and throughout the region. Would you care to elaborate a bit on some of those challenges that you see to the rule of law?
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I come from a continent where we pay a lot of attention to ritual. And what I believe has not been done adequately is to pay attention to ritualizing the transition from oppressive, whether it's colonial, in our case, apartheid regimes, to democratic regimes. And as a result, despite our wonderful constitution, which has been celebrated globally, we are struggling to live up to the expectations of the rule of law and other elements of that constitution. You have seen with the index, we are quite an outlier when it comes to issues of equity, etc. So my contribution is that those who are dealing with issues of the rule of law and constitutional matters need to pay a lot more attention to the cultural element. We know from global scholarship that constitutions don't change cultures, but we have to find ways of cleansing societies that have been through conflict or through oppressive, humiliating regimes to enable them to embrace the values of the democratic order and the rule of law. In Africa, we have a very simple technology that when you want to cook for a big feast, you use a three-legged pot because it's the most stable and it happens to cook very beautiful cuisine because it's slow cooking. In the case of the transition of South Africa from the apartheid era to the new era, we did a fantastic job of promoting the one leg of that pot, which is the political settlement with our wonderful constitution. But the drafters of the constitution were wise enough to know that we needed rituals to accompany the political settlement. But sadly, 23 years down the line, we still haven't done the second leg of that pot, which is an emotional settlement, to deal with issues of how do people heal the wounds of humiliation that were visited upon them for centuries? And how do they embed and establish the values of equity, of justice, of openness, so that we don't have this idea that a political party, because it was a liberation party, has all the answers. And a third leg, which is also essential, is the socio-economic transformation. If we don't have a three-legged pot, which is what we don't have in South Africa right now, we don't have the technology to develop an economy that is inclusive, that is sustainable, and that everybody feels that they can buy into. So our constitution, there is a huge gap between this globally celebrated constitution and the practice on the ground. And I'm proposing that you need ritual cleansing of the old to allow the present to give birth to the kind of socio-political and economic culture that can sustain the rule of law.
Thank you very much. Mr. Nery, you're in the Philippines. Lots of activity in the Philippines these days.
And
you've been reading and writing and commenting on all of that. So, and in one of our discussions, you actually used a term, weaponizing the rule of law. Can you share that with the audience, please?
Thank you. Maybe I can start with a quick response to Dr. Ramphele's beautiful point about the rituals of transition. It resonates with our experience as an emerging democracy. We thought that the issue before was whether we are just at the stage of procedural democracy versus substantive democracy. It turns out that today, even the modest gains we've achieved in procedural democracy are under attack, under threat. And this was what I was talking about. Unfortunately, I don't have good news for my country. President Duterte campaigned on a platform of change which included explicit references to violence. Several occasions he said, I will fill Manila Bay with 100,000 corpses. I don't know how many people have died in his so-called war. It's not a real war, it's an assault, a sustained assault on the poor. So-called war on drugs, probably at least 6,000, maybe 12,000. But he has moved from maybe what we can call a spectacle of violence. People are intimidated enough already. He's moving to taking over the institutions of democracy. He has appointed some very dubious people to positions of power, especially in the administration of justice. And these people have turned the rule of law into a weapon. We have an incumbent senator who is in jail on trumped-up charges. And she is in jail because there was what is effectively a collusion between the Justice Department and the lower house, the House of Representatives, which sought to put her there. So yes, I would say that not only is the rule of law in our country under attack, it itself is sometimes misused as a weapon of attack.
Dean Magill, you're in the business and it's your mission in life to educate leaders for the future, to ground them in law and policy in a way that they can go out into the world and affect positive change. What are some of the things that a global law school like Stanford can do and other educational institutions, not just in the U.S., but around the world? We heard yesterday at the anti-corruption program, we heard of some wonderful programs in Algeria where the Anti-Corruption Commission there is partnering with schools and colleges to educate young people at the college level and then actually in the training and education of public officials. And so that's a partnership I think we could all look at and learn from. So what can Stanford do? What can other institutions of education do on the broad spectrum?
Well, let me join others in saying I really appreciate being here and being on this panel, and I would like to hear more about South Africa and the Philippines. But
You will.
so I've given some thought. I've given some thought to the question, and there's the sort of broad question of what can educators do to deepen and promote the rule of law. I'll talk mostly about what we do in law schools and my thinking about that. I think one of the wonderful things about the World Justice Project is the idea that it obviously cannot be lawyers talking to each other about rule of law, that rule of law affects all in society and all human flourishing, and involving all in that conversation is the right way to move forward. With that caveat, I'm going to talk a little bit about lawyers who are just part of the picture. I think people with a legal education kind of naturally appreciate the value of the rule of law, believe in it when they're following their best selves. So I think the first step for legal educators is probably to remind their students in the education they provide to them and the opportunities they provide to them of their obligation to serve the broader society, whether they are in the private bar or working in government or working in civil society organizations, that part of being a lawyer is that instinctive understanding of some of the key elements of rule of law, and that serving yourself is not enough. And I think in many countries, certainly the United States and many others I know of, there is this sense that a lawyer has a broader responsibility, sometimes defined as a responsibility to the court, sometimes as a responsibility to the broader society. But awakening that and inculcating that in legal education, I think, is a very important thing, because lawyers should be natural allies of rule of law, should be natural advocates for it because of their training and their understanding of its significance, and tapping into that knowledge for the broader good, I think, is a really important first step. The second thing, I think, is legal education, and I come from a country that I think has long thought. It has established rule of law. There are deep rule of law issues in the United States, as anyone who studies it could tell you. But especially those countries that view themselves to be on the right side of the World Justice Project scale, I think legal education in those countries has to be deep and rich enough to make students aware of the history of threats to rule of law and the consequences of the threats to rule of law, and make it quite real to them that it's a fragile thing that must be constantly advocated for and constantly worked on. And I think sometimes we just in the States kind of take for granted that the government doesn't win just because it's the government, or the wealthiest people don't win because they are the wealthiest people in a dispute resolution. That, first of all, isn't always true, but secondly, it's not something that should be taken for granted. So I think particularly in places where there's a strong rule of law tradition, the education has to be deep and rich to have the students see the threats along with reminding them of their obligation to others and the society. The last thing I'd say, which is certainly a trend I know in legal education globally, a trend in the United States, is giving students practical opportunities to engage in a very direct level in work that relates to rule of law. At Stanford, we have a bunch of different programs that do that. We have opportunities for our students to act as lawyers for needy individuals whose experience with the justice system is quite awful. We have a rule of law program that does projects in different countries, in Afghanistan, in Rwanda, and Bhutan. Some are law reform projects, some are helping develop a legal curriculum. These are very practical, educationally powerful experiences for students to see for themselves in a very direct way what they might have learned in an abstract and, I think, intellectually important way, what it means to threaten rule of law. They can see it with the person they're working with, and I think that changes their own sense of the fragility of rule of law and the need to be constantly working for it. If I were czar of all education in the world, William, I would find a way to inculcate in early education through university education these basic, very fundamental ideas about that the World Justice Project's identified about accountability, about fairness in dispute resolution, because these are matters that are in children's games when they're 3, when they're resolving a dispute about jacks or whatever the game happens to be. These are very, I think, intuitive ideas, accepting absolutely that there are some cultural challenges in how we translate them. But I don't see any reason why those ideas couldn't be infused in education from its very first moment through the most technical legal education. So if I could run all of education, that's what I would do, William.
Well, I think that's a wonderful point, and I hope it's a challenge for all of us throughout the world, in all countries. And yesterday, I think, if I recall, Justice Ginsburg had mentioned that it had been the mission of Justice O'Connor once she left the Supreme Court of the U.S. to get involved in this civics education at the most basic level and incorporate it in children's games and literature and that sort of thing to begin that process. Juan, you have been with the Rule of Law Index now for a decade. And what changes have you seen over that 10 years from the time that you began work with the World Justice Project on the Rule of Law Index? How has your learning evolved as you look back over the last 10 years? About what have you seen in the rule of law across the world? And you can be specific or general in your response.
Thank you. Do I have 3 hours to?
No, you have 3 minutes.
The learning is humility, because sometimes when we try to advocate, even though the position of the World Justice Project has always been to be owners, brokers of data and information, and try to let the solutions and let the answers come from the specific societies in which we work and with which we collaborate, and not to provide the answers from our end. Many of us in the international development world had the impression that the rule of law was checked in certain parts of the world. Yes, there has been access to justice issues in the United States, discrimination in the United States, issues in the criminal justice system, or perceived discrimination. There has been issues of police abuse in Europe for a decade. I mean, the surveys systematically show issues of concern in those fronts in these parts of the world and other parts of the world. And what we've seen in the last couple of years is how what we take for granted sometimes can change so rapidly. As Dean Magill just mentioned, it is of critical importance, part of this movement, to recognize and to take on the task of making everybody aware that the rule of law is just a concept, and it's a concept that is so powerful that creates the foundation of society, but this concept is fragile and has to be defended and guarded every day. So at the same time that we have been seeing these challenges, however, we've also seen wonderful stories. One that is not widely known in the rest of the world, it has had tremendous impact in Latin America, is the case of Brazil. Brazil is a country that, if you take the index ranking, ranks in the middle. Latin America starts from 20 Uruguay and to 113 Venezuela. But Brazil is in the middle, has been in the middle. Brazil has undergone a major problem, societal shaking, based on corruption. One president was ousted. The current president is in proceedings in Congress because of corruption. And the country is thriving. Because what we see in Brazil, a young democracy, is very strong rule of law fundamentals. A powerful and independent, ethical judiciary, strong civil society organizations, freedom of the press, and those fundamentals have enabled society, when the viruses come, the immune system of society, which is the rule of law, protects the society and allows it to prosper and move on. So in the same case, in the same instance, a similar country like Turkey The scores in Brazil and Turkey were the same 5 years ago. We see very different outcomes. We see very different situation in Venezuela and Brazil. But we see a lot of positive cases as well that give us hope that as long as these strong rule of law fundamentals remain in place, the world will progress.
Don't we see around the world how fragile these institutions are? There's certainly challenges now in the United States we've never seen before, and we're having to deal with all sorts of new issues that we took for granted, certain processes, and then we see major legislation being drafted behind closed doors, whereas you would think something like that in our tradition, there would be months of hearings and experts would come in and provide guidance on the best policy opportunities there would be for reforming our healthcare system. So we're all in the midst of some upheaval, I think, now. So Dr. Ramphele, outside of the country of South Africa itself, around in the region, what do you see as some of the challenges and opportunities for us to strengthen the rule of law and provide that kind of emotional attachment to it that is so critical to its being sustained, and also opportunities for more economic fairness?
I mean, taking from Elizabeth's point about the universal principles needing to be part of the educational system from grade 0 all the way to university, I couldn't agree with you more. The cultural elements I'm bringing in are simple realities that if you lived in a colonial African country where the rule of law was used to oppress you, you need to create a culturally conducive environment for embracing the rule of law in the new system. And that work has not been done in any of the post-colonial African countries, which is why it is not surprising that post-colonial governments, most of whom are built out of the former liberation movements, use that gap to justify ignoring the rule of law or applying it as a weapon, or just simply setting aside, such as we have seen with South Africa and other countries in this amendment to the protocol of international justice that happened in Bamako in 2016, which was all about protecting leaders from accountability. And because African citizens have not had the ritualized process of embracing the values in their constitutions that include the rule of law, they don't immediately stand up and say, but you can't do that. Because they're not sure. When they hear that the ICC is all there in order to target African leaders, the ICC is ignoring, for example, abuses of power by leaders in the West. And there is some validity in that. But that doesn't, as you said in the case of Brazil, the fact that there is some wrong being done somewhere else is not justification for you as a country like South Africa, where the fundamentals of our constitution are not just human rights in general, but equality before the law. So that protocol that our president, together with other African countries, signed is actually at variance with our very constitution. And our president is meant to be the custodian and the protector and the promoter of our constitution. And so I believe that civic education, together with this ritual of embracing new values that include the rule of law, but also the fundamental socio-economic transformation that creates an inclusive economic and social system that people feel that it's not the rule of law is not just protecting the elites, but it's protecting them I mean, you showed us pictures of choices. That's my country. Where I live, of course, I live on the clean side, but 80% of South Africans live where other people have made the choices, that the rule of law doesn't matter for them. And so I think the biggest issue in post-colonial Africa is to practicalize, to make the rule of law matter at the level of day-to-day lives of every citizen. And this is the work that is ahead of us in South Africa. That is why I'm talking about the need for the three-legged pot to be made whole by paying attention to how we enable South Africans to embrace the Constitution, not as something imposed as a matter of political settlement, but as something that really matters in their lives. But it also has to lead to the practical side of we cannot have an economy that continues to benefit 10% of the population at the expense of the rest. And that's happening and is legal. And as far as a lot of people are concerned, the protection of property rights in our Constitution, which is a correct approach, without the foundations of a socioeconomic transformative program, it renders illegitimate the protection of property rights. And that is what is being used by those who want to perpetuate their own interests as an excuse to delegitimate, to be critical of the Constitution. And so it's really important that that equity, in that order, the equity part, is what we need to create an embracing socio-cultural environment for the rule of law.
Thank you. Thank you. John, a free press, the ability to communicate to the population what's going on and what expose corruption. Do you find your days more challenging now than in the past?
Certainly. The quick answer there is that it's a much more hostile environment. On the other hand, there are a lot of great stories, and that has energized. But it's also been enervating. Many of our young journalists are drained by the amount of news, false or otherwise, generated by the change happening in the Philippines. And I don't think it's limited to the Philippines. Once again, I find myself taking off from something that Dr. Ramphele said. One way of understanding President Duterte, perhaps, is that he's a post-colonial nationalist in the age of social media. So I had occasion once to describe it as an irritable nationalism. You can explain his anti-Americanism that way. He is responding to rejecting that background of ours as having been colonized by the United States. Although he has never said a word about the Japanese occupation of the Philippines or the Spanish colonization. On the other hand, this irritable nationalism is amplified on social media. I spoke to one of the director of social media strategy for his campaign, and one of their pillars was, he didn't use this term, but they have a social media army. And it's very revealing that very early in fact, before their term had started, the incoming finance secretary said, we are going to retain the network of social media volunteers, and which I thought was very interesting. I mean, why would the finance secretary, incidentally a very well-respected businessman, say that? So they see this, that it's a way to cut through the mediation of standard media, so to speak. So that definitely the environment for journalists has been made much more challenging. There's outright hostility, especially to women journalists. I mean, Our own website gets about 3,500 to 4,000 comments every day, and about 3,000 of those are abusive and offensive. And it's even worse on other websites. The level of vitriol directed at women journalists, it's just awful. So it really is very difficult. The Inquirer actually put together what we call the kill list. So it was really just our attempts. We have about 80 correspondents around the country to get police reports, and we just put them together. And these were victims of the so-called war on drugs. But when there was a pause in this so-called war in January, we stopped. And my primary reason for stopping was that the person in charge of the list was too traumatized. I didn't want her to proceed with the work. And it's just, name after name after name of ordinary people being killed for mere possession, supposedly, of illegal drugs. So yeah, the challenge is much greater these days.
Liz, yesterday in your conversation with Justice Ginsburg, you touched on the subject of judicial independence and why that's important. And it was here, I think, at our last World Justice Forum at The Hague, Justice Kennedy said, judicial independence is not so that judges can do what they want, but so that we can do what we must. And I always was struck by that phrase, and certainly, again, we've seen recently sort of an acceleration and a rise in the intensity of criticism of our judges in the United States and elsewhere. Can you comment a little bit about why that's a threat to the rule of law, the attacks on the judiciary, and why it's important that judges maintain their independence?
Of course, I think I might be preaching to the choir here, since this is a World Justice Project convening. I say first a couple words about the attacks, which I think are viewed to be unusual. I actually think if you go all the way back in American history to the earliest part of the Republic, the election of 1800, and we've actually seen worse, but that's the historian in me. There's a sort of, at least in the American system or the US system, a sort of etiquette and the line you don't cross, I think, and I hope the virus is responded to is questioning the legitimacy of the judge. So the use of the term the so-called judge, the attacks on the individual nature of a judge, the judge's particular history. You can criticize the decision, you can say I disagree with the decision, but in the US culture, crossing that line of questioning whether the person is actually a judge and or threatening that the judge will be responsible for attacks on the United States, which some political actors have come pretty close to, I would say, is, I think, it's not the same as some threats to the rule of law, I think, or the judicial independence that happens in other countries. These judges are not being threatened with being shot or taken out of office at the federal level, but that's a quite important line to cross, and I actually think the patient is doing pretty well, to use Juan's terms, in terms of the reaction to those sorts of attacks on federal judges. That was a fairly unified response, that was an unacceptable attack and threatened the independence of the judiciary at the federal level. And of course, the independence of the judiciary is necessary to maintain the rule of law for kind of very basic reasons. They need the capacity to tell political actors they violated the law, thinking about the cases in the states. I think the threats to the independence of the judiciary at the state level in the United States are much more severe because of what Justice Ginsburg referred to yesterday, which is the election of judges or judges standing for retention elections. And we tend to get controversies about judges at the state level when they have issued some decision that is unpopular. And that's when you get a contested judicial election, which is exactly when you don't want the judge to be taken out of office for issuing an unpopular decision. So there are cases, there's a well-known case in West Virginia where the Supreme Court actually said this violated the Constitution, the threat to judicial independence here, where there was a decision that deeply offended some very well-off individuals, and they mounted a campaign to defeat those judges, and they did, and that was an extreme case. But so I think the threat in the states is greater, actually, because of the role of judicial elections. So that's what I have to say about the states. I think this audience probably is on board with the significance of an independent judiciary and being able to stand up to powerful interests, whether they be the government or interests with a lot of money, when they need to do so, as Justice Kennedy said, when they must.
Juan, as we assess the geopolitical landscape, you're fairly close to the situations in Venezuela and Colombia. What are the lessons learned there? How did things unravel, and what can we do? What could be done to strengthen the stability in some of the South American countries that are currently in some state of turmoil?
Well, the situation in Latin America is one that has for quite a long time now have shown challenges in terms of high rates of crime. We see that from Mexico to Argentina. Weaknesses in the criminal justice system, corruption both at the low level and at the highest levels. Those issues have been present for a long time. However, the situation is not as simple. It's it is not univocal. It is one that requires attention to the multiple aspects of the rule of law index. And taking all of those into consideration, we see that the stories in the international media and in the international community tend to simplify the reality and tend to say, for instance, in the case of my country, Colombia, is a rock star, it's a success story, we signed peace, we're a failed society. 20 years ago, the most violent place in the world, 25 years when I was growing up. And now it's a peaceful, rule of law abiding society. The story is not that. The truth is 2 steps forward, 1 step back. For us that supported the peace deal in Colombia, we are of course delighted that it happened. But we also need to recognize that perhaps the majority of the population disagree with that result. The referendum was issued and it was defeated. So imagine a situation in which we have Brexit and the government the next day of the referendum says, no, we didn't mean it, sorry. We are not going to Brexit. That's what happened in Colombia. So it is a story that has 2 shades of gray. I still believe it is constitutional, but several prominent former presidents and others have said it was a violation of the Constitution. So the rule of law fundamentals there, if we believe in the long run, the case of Colombia certainly shows a positive trend, as the case in Venezuela shows the opposite trend. And it started with something that we also see in, let's say, Eastern European countries, in Poland and Hungary, the use of the law as a tool to target specific segments of the population, centers of power, the independence of the media, the courts, the control authorities, the universities, the civil society organizations, a targeted attack on the entities and organizations in society that are the backbone of a rule of law society. As the great Arthur Chaskalson, our honorary chair, said here in this forum, I don't know, 5-6 years ago, the rule of law is a culture. It's a culture of the rule of law. It's not ruled by law. It's not what you have in the books. It is that the society internalizes these values. So what we see in South America is some level of internalization in openness of government and protection of the free press and so on, and at the same time, simultaneously, serious attacks on those institutions, most notably in Venezuela, but elsewhere as well.
But isn't the question of complacency, whether you're looking at the United States with several centuries of the rule of law, that you really take it for granted it will happen? I mean, how else did you get to the president you have? And I would say, in my country as well, we became very complacent. After signing the political settlement in '94, everybody was telling us how wonderful we were, and we forgot to do the homework of embedding the values of what we had agreed to in the practices of our society, so that when these attacks happen, as they did also in my country, the use of the law to attack opponents, people don't react the first time it happens. By the time they react, we further down the track, and it's much more difficult. And you have a lot more people on the side of the populist rhetoric that's there, that this is all about regime change. I mean, even in South Africa at the time of President Mbeki, when he was an AIDS denialist, he regarded any criticism of that stance as an attempt at regime change. I mean, excuse me, how is that related? But there were people in South Africa who actually believed him. They believed that it must have something to do with the pharmaceutical industry that wanted to sell ARVs. So what? Because people are dying. I mean, so I think the point you are raising, whether it's the changes in Venezuela or in other parts of the world, including in Africa, is that it starts slowly and people don't respond, and the complacency of the rest of the population allows those who are undermining the rule of law to run away with the ball.
That's a good point. Our panel, when we had our pre-session discussions, was keenly interested in having some participation from the audience. So now I think this is a good time for any of you who may have a question of any one or all of our panelists to please stand up and ask your question. Now, there is one rule here. No speeches, just a question, okay? Please, sir. Now, what country?
Rule by law and not rule of law.
Okay.
So in the context of rule of law, what can you do for my country?
Okay. What country did you say you were from?
Singapore.
Singapore. Okay. John, you would like to respond? I think there was a question there about freedom of expression.
I defer to your experience about Singapore, although I do know other people who live and who work there, in fact, many journalists. I am not sure if, in fact, it is the last in the list. My impression is that there is a certain set of questions that may not be asked, but almost everything else is fair game. I just came from Singapore about 2 weeks ago, and that was the time that this embarrassing family scandal about the ruling family came out, and I did not expect it to be the front page of the Straits Times. But again, you live there, so you have a better appreciation. I think one thing is regional alliances of newspapers, for instance, would be a good way to reinforce individual newspapers' commitment to principles of the free press. But of course, it's very we're very Asian, and sometimes we have to ask. We had so I belong to I represent my newspaper in the Asian News Network, and we had a situation with Myanmar, and we needed to ask our partner in Myanmar, would it be helpful to your case? He was on trumped-up charges and he was in jail, if we issue a statement. And I think the answer is it varies from country to country. So we also take that into, I think a regional alliance like that would take that into account. But really the exchange of information that such alliances make possible, I think might be a good way to reinforce commitment to the free press.
William,
Yes.
if I may add just a quick note there. In general, the issue of the free press and the relationship with the rule of law, in our definition, the World Justice Project view, is the first principle that Bill presented earlier, is government accountability. And government accountability is of public and private actors. And this government accountability is under a set of laws that are fair, and this set of laws include the checks and balances. And the checks and balances is not only the independent judiciary, but also the non-governmental checks. So the role of the free press is as a non-governmental check and balance on the government's power. It also implies accountability of the press itself to the truth. But that is one of the fundamental pillars, is in Pillar 1, Principle 1, Factor 1 of the Rule of Law Index and of our WJP definition.
Thank you. Other questions? Lady on the third row, please.
You have to wait for the microphone because everyone can hear the question.
Here comes a microphone.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. This question touches upon, or comes from, I think, points that all the speakers have made. It's something that I'm looking at with increasing concern, which is almost the inability of average, everyday people in democratic or semi-democratic societies to be able to tell truth from fiction so as to be able to participate informedly in democracies and the rule of law. And I think Dr. Ramphele mentioned people didn't know, was this correct, was this not? We've seen the proliferation of conspiracy theories, and people that I thought had a pretty serious developed world education falling prey to the weirdest conspiracy theories on some of these outlying websites and I don't know, list feeds, I'm not sure what these things are. How do we pick apart those issues when confronted with things like freedom of the press and freedom of opinion so as not to destroy the infrastructure that we're aiming for?
You want to take that?
Well, I would love to hear some solutions. I think there's much conversation, in the States about how, fake news and what's a fact, and people conventionally tend to attribute it to, we are so deeply divided. We've been extremely divided before in the United States. I don't think it's that. I think the threat is the technological advances, which have brought us so much, allow the hijacking of personality, allow you can see a video and you don't know whether what you are seeing is actually true. You don't know if the person who has emailed you is the person who has emailed you. And this is just the beginning of the capacity to create what looks like something real that is entirely manufactured. And I think that is deeply, deeply threatening. There have always been people who've been purveyors of propaganda and false information, but from for many centuries across many nations. But I think this is a new and different threat. And when, of course, as a lawyer devoted to all legal systems are quite interested in how do you find a fact, how do you test a fact, that's a key part of how you set up a dispute resolution system. And if we don't actually have a way to do that, the weak are always going to suffer, in my opinion. So the weakest in society are going to suffer. So I don't have a solution. Maybe technology will give us a solution. I think it is deeply threatening. I think you can paint a picture that the end of the Enlightenment, it's a quite threatening fact. I've provided no optimism whatsoever. So maybe someone has a
we're
solution.
We're going to finish on some optimism in a minute.
I'm optimistic.
All right.
Because in my country, I know that one of the biggest problems we have is the quality of education. It's one thing to have a degree, but have you developed your critical thinking capabilities? And that is missing in our education system by and large, even the most sophisticated private schools. Second point is, if you have a society that is traumatized, and now we know enough about neuroscience that actually trauma can be multi-generational. And so all you need is someone to link whatever is happening to something that has happened in the past, and people immediately buy it. Like, white people are going to do X, right? In an environment where we have not quite dealt with the past, we haven't healed the wounds that were inflicted upon us, it's very easy to accept that. And of course, we have in South Africa a president who knows how to play that game. So whenever there is a problem, is white monopoly capital? Yes, white people are predominant owners of capital in South Africa. But you use certain catchphrases to catch people. I would think some people said during the Trump administration, campaign, that they went to these places where homeless, very poor white people were living, and were able to energize them. The majority of well-to-do people, complacency again, did not get up and vote. Right. Those people were told, this is your chance. Here's someone who really cares about you, who's coming in, and you should vote. So I think there is not one way of dealing with the problem. The technology helps and also creates problems. But I think it calls upon all of us, whatever part of the world we live in, to help young people develop their critical faculties so that they will be able, even if they're not lawyers, to ask, how does this make sense?
Steve, do you have a question? Microphone down to the front, please. Hold on a second, please. Hold on 1 second, please.
I think this panel has done an excellent job in identifying the problems. And I think in large measure, this conference will identify the problems as you go through the different panels. The problem is identifying the solutions. Doctor, you indicated that the culture was a major stumbling block. There are a number of other stumbling blocks we've heard and we'll hear more. Can we focus on the same type of question and answer that we just had heard as to what the possible solutions might be, so we can take those back as a great benefit from this conference and try to act on them? For example, the cultural issue, I don't know if you deal with it with education or other ways, but it would be helpful if, as part of the discussion, we can talk about the solution once we identify the problems that we all live with.
And I must say that many of the breakout sessions are designed just to do that, to share best practices, to engage in strengthening platforms, and the World Justice Project has consistently, through its engagement efforts, tried to share those ideas and actually fund some of these mini grant programs to strengthen the rule of law. So there are hundreds of examples of those kinds of programs, and we'll be talking about those throughout the conference today.
And in the next panel.
The
Yes.
next panel is precisely that. And William, if I may add, part of this is the core. I mean, you hit the nail. This is the hair of the nail. This is the key issue. But part of the approach of the World Justice Project to this issue is that we start by recognizing that the rule of law is something that is deeply rooted in context. So we do not come to countries with, this is the list of recommendations, this is the solutions, this is what you should do, this is what you should. We believe that these have to come from the ground up. As Shaskalson said, again, is the culture embedded in the homegrown culture of the rule of law. So our solution, as difficult as it is one brick at a time, building the building one brick at a time, in promoting this homegrown adoption of the fundamental principles of the rule of law, including respect for the press, respect for the freedom of civil society organizations, independence of the judiciary, accountability, open government, access to information, all of these components that are in the index and in the definition, building them one brick at a time.
We just happen to have a constitution that has set out in the preamble, where the drafters of the constitution anticipated the need to deal with embedding this constitutional framework in the culture of the people. But we didn't do what we said we will do. We said we will heal the wounds of the past. We had the TRC, which was about amnesty for the generals and other operatives. But in terms of healing the humiliation of the majority by a minority, we didn't do it. Second, we came from a culture which is very authoritarian, very oppressive, where law was used against the people. So we needed to create a new value system from the home, the church, the synagogue, the school, the university. We didn't do that. And third, we said we will pay attention to the quality of life of everybody. We haven't done that. South Africa has not yet transformed its socioeconomic system. We have done BEE, that's not, you can't affirm the majority by a minority. You need to rethink, which we didn't do. So I believe there are instruments, and I agree they'll be discussed in detail in different contexts, but these are just, I think what I'm saying can be applied to the rest of the continent quite easily in a very context-specific way. But if we don't do that, if we do not invest in the healing of wounds, in the embedding of the values, in the transformation of the socioeconomic systems, it's going to be extremely difficult to have sustainable rule of law regimes in any part of the world.
One more question.
William, if I may,
John,
I'd like to make a...
Somebody else raise your, all right, let's get a microphone to the lady in the middle, and you'll have the last question. Go ahead, John.
But if I may, I'd like to offer a modest suggestion, a solution. Maybe one of the things we can do is we can agree not to use the term fake news. If we can't not use it, let's use it in quotation marks. The reason is that it's in fact a partisan use of the language. If we need to refer to false information, let's say so. Let's say it's misinformation, it's a lie, it's disinformation. But fake news actually is an attack on real news. It's not collateral damage, it's the main target, it's the main object of the attack. So the reason why large institutions and their spokesmen will say, you know, that's fake news, you're fake news, is because they want to delegitimize standard media organizations. So I don't know, maybe if that's something that we can agree on, let's call a lie. Let's say it's misinformation or disinformation. Notice that Facebook, which has rolled out a anti-false information campaign, does not call it fake news, precisely for the same reason. They call it false news, which is, you know, the same, although it's a slight improvement.
Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you. I come from Guatemala, and I would ask you, we had a scandal just like the one Juan mentioned about Brazil. We have right now our president and vice president and most of the cabinets, congressmen and a lot of people facing a trial for the first time. How can we restore the confidence of the population in anything that has to be with democracy or institutions it seems in our country that people don't want to believe in anyone anymore, and politics less than anyone. Thank you.
Anyone care to respond? Juan?
Well, if you look at the findings of the index in Guatemala in page 90, you see many challenges in the country. As in, from Mexico to Argentina, well, now from the United States to Argentina, we see many challenges in the rule of law. But you also see some signs of hope. You see that based on surveys of the random sample of the population, you see that the answers and the strength of the non-governmental checks is reported to be high. This is the early indication of hope for the future. Yes, corruption is rampant and has been, I mean, the scores is in the legislators close to the minimum in the world. But there are other elements that show the checks and balances beginning to work. And that is in the long run what takes a society from a non-rule of law to a rule of law situation. So I see some elements of hope. Of course, we can go to the details of Guatemala after the break in any level of detail.
All right, let's pick up on that. Yesterday, again, in Liz's questioning of Justice Ginsburg, the question was asked, are you an optimist or a pessimist? And of course, she responded that she's an optimist. And Juan just, in reference to Guatemala, talked about signs of hope. So as we conclude our panel this morning, why don't we start, John, with you, and we'll go through the panel here and see what signs of hope do you see? What do we have to be optimistic about as we think of the rule of law in a global context?
Sources of hope would include the very communications technology that is itself a source of despair, because social media can also be used for good. So there is, in the Philippines as well as in the United States, and there has been some pushback, I mean considerable pushback in these platforms. So for us, I realize that I represent a traditional media organization, and it's not exactly routine for us to say, hey, there are other sources of information, but that's the new ecosystem. And I actually think that is in fact a source of hope. We cannot stay in the old paradigm where professional gatekeepers like me decide all of the news. Sometimes the news has to be defined by other sources on search media or on social media. And for me, the fact that there are different ways of defining news is actually a source of hope.
Yes.
Well, my source of hope is being in an educational institution and being exposed to the next generation of people. I think anyone here who's in an educational institution, I hope that's the feeling you have. Whenever I have those low moments, I go find some students and talk to them about their ambitions and what they want to do in the world, and I have hope.
Dr. Ramphele?
I come from a continent with the youngest population profile. And each time I speak to young people in my own country or in the region, I know that there is hope for an Africa that can rise to its potential. And the way they are using social media is to connect across the boundaries that their leaders are not prepared to cross. But also at a very micro level, I know that the negative that is being built up by those who want to undermine our democracy in South Africa is driven through saying that the Constitution is an imposition. And it's so wonderful to see the positive response of young people to intergenerational conversations. When I explain to them that what's in that Constitution is what people died fighting for. I'm one of those people from that generation that fought for this freedom. We fought for that Bill of Rights. We fought for the rule of law. So please, there may be things that are not perfect in the Constitution, but the fundamentals, those are the products of sacrifice. And those young people rise to the occasion. So I have no doubt that there is hope for all of us.
Thank you.
I would like to echo Bill's geopolitical challenges and resources, and especially the human spirit. When we look back in the 4,000 years of history, and you read in the Hammurabi Code that the law was created to protect the weak from the strong, not to protect the strong from the weak, as it is used sometimes in the rule by law, but to protect the weak from the strong. And this, over the last 4,000 years, you see so many challenges. The human spirit has always raised to the occasion and always overcome it. So ultimately, I'm complete optimist.
Thank you. Would you join me in thanking our panelists today for their contributions? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.